It is perhaps the most enduring question of them all. What happens to us after we die? The answer proposed by the ancient Egyptians would unify their society for 3,000 years and motivate the construction of some of the world's greatest buildings. The Egyptians did not view death as a grim finality. Rather, it was seen as the start of an uplifting transformation in which body and soul were reconfigured for eternal life.
The Egyptians believed that everybody was alive because of a vital force that was in all of us and that left us when we died, and that's the Ka. When a mother or a father has a son or a daughter, they say, "My Ka repeats itself." When you go to the necropolis to be buried, the ancient texts say, "The Kas of my ancestors are reaching out to me."
Once the body of the deceased was placed in a tomb, it was the Ka that lived on. It ventured out of the burial chamber at dawn and returned at nightfall. Constructing an eternal resting place for the Ka was an all-consuming passion for Egypt's pharaohs, more important even than building a royal palace. Only the temples of the gods themselves would equal this astonishing grandeur. This glorious legacy rose from modest beginnings, bricks made of mud scooped from the banks of the Nile. The pliant earth was pressed into a simple wooden mold, then left to bake under the fiery Egyptian sun. Even built of this humble material, Egypt's earliest tombs offered a hint of the wonders to come. Known as a mastaba, the Arabic word for bench, these tombs first appeared around 3000 BC. Eventually, mastaba builders smoothed the recesses out of the walls, leaving just a niche on the east side. There, relatives or funerary priests could bring offerings for the Ka of the dead. The placement of the niche on the east side was no accident. To the ancient Egyptians, the rebirth of the Ka was an eternal cycle, like that of the sun. Every night, the great disk plunged to its death in the west. Yet each dawn, it came to life in the east. In like manner, the Ka was born anew each morning, and it found life-sustaining offerings on the east side of the mastaba.
The basic idea of an Egyptian tomb is some kind of superstructure above the ground that is accessible to the living, where they can come and leave offerings, and the burial chamber beneath the ground that is permanently inaccessible to all but the spirit of the deceased.
This Egyptian mastaba was reconstructed inside the Field Museum in Chicago, Illinois. Though built of stone, it displays all the elements of its mud brick predecessors. It was originally the tomb of a prince named Unis Ankh, the son of a 5th dynasty pharaoh. The rooms and courtyard above ground were accessible to the living. Here, offerings would be left for the Ka of the deceased prince. Permanently sealed in a subterranean burial chamber was a sarcophagus. Inside, the mummified body of Unis Ankh. The focal point of the entire tomb is found above ground in the offering chapel. Here, the world of the living and the realm of the dead actually touch. This sacred junction is known as the false door.
In an inner chamber of the tomb, there was a dummy door made out of solid rock, but the door didn't open. You see, it was a dummy door, but it was here that offerings were given, food offerings, sometimes called ka'u, for the Ka of the deceased. It was here that they communed with the deceased through chanting and incense and offerings.
Very often, a statue or an image of the deceased person was placed in that doorway in the position of walking out, to represent that the person's soul is now contained in that image and is moving from the netherworld into this world in order to receive offerings that the family or anyone else might bring to it.
During the reign of the earliest ruling families or dynasties, mud brick mastabas were used for most burials. However, they had one significant flaw: impermanence. Bricks were vulnerable to the elements and to local farmers who coveted the rich Nile mud as fertilizer. Many of these ancient buildings either crumbled away or were plowed back into the earth. If Egyptian kings were building for eternity, they would need a material that could stand the test of time. Around 2650 BC, during the reign of a third dynasty pharaoh named Djoser, stone architecture made its dramatic first appearance. This sprawling 37-acre funerary complex juts from the desert at a place called Saqqara. It was enclosed by a wall more than 1 mile in length. Rising boldly within was a step pyramid some 200 feet high, the first monumental stone building in the history of the world.
It's much, much larger than any monument that came before it. No question about it, by a factor of 3 or 4. It's a huge increase in size, and it is built entirely of stone.
3.5 miles of hallways, shafts, and storage chambers were quarried out beneath the compound. The subterranean labyrinth included an astonishing total of more than 400 rooms. The monument was the work of Djoser's chancellor, a high priest named Imhotep. His fame reverberated through the centuries. The Greeks even regarded him as a god. Among Imhotep's many innovations was the depiction in stone of a sacred enclosure known as the Divine Booth. Originally, this structure was built of stakes and retractable reed mats. Imhotep transformed these simple materials into a timeless architectural design.
It's called the cavetto cornice with a torus molding. Now, that became the classic front of an Egyptian temple throughout the rest of Egyptian history. This is one of the first true cornices, you see, where you roll out like that and then flare out. It's a kind of aha way to finish off a building. In fact, that inspired the cornice that was handed down through the world of architecture to today.
There were other unique features at Saqqara. In one of the subterranean galleries, Djoser is depicted during a ritual known as Hebsed, in which the king sprints around a courtyard to symbolically revitalize his royal power. A large Hebsed court was indeed laid out next to the step pyramid. However, it is unlikely that Djoser ever ran here, at least while he was alive. This giant complex was built for Djoser's use after his death.
Many of the buildings, if not all of them, in the Djoser complex were dummies. They're like a Western stage set or a Hollywood stage, in that you have these models of buildings with beautifully carved facades, but inside the building is just filled with debris. There's no real inside to the building whatsoever. It was a big special effect, a sacred special effect. The effect they were trying to achieve was to set Djoser up in the afterlife.
This statue was part of the special effect. It was placed in a sealed room near the pyramid's northern face. Djoser's Ka would emerge through it from the netherworld, perhaps to run the Hebsed and assure his eternal reign. Though Imhotep's daring monument was a tremendous achievement, there were a few reminders that stone construction was still a new art. The masonry blocks are small, roughly the size of mud bricks, suggesting Imhotep wasn't yet prepared to wrestle with giant hunks of limestone. There was one other sign of Imhotep's uncertainty.
Almost all the columns are engaged. That is, they're still attached to the walls. So he wasn't sure about yet the ability of stone to support the great weight of the roofs. So he had the columns attached to the walls.
Other Third Dynasty kings would copy Djoser's step pyramid, but these structures fell victim to a fatal design flaw.
The step pyramids are made out of accretions, big sheets of stone like the skins of an onion. and they lean against a central core. And the stones are laid on courses or beds sloping down in towards the pyramid. Apparently, the Egyptians believed this increased structural stability. In fact, it decreased the stability.
The peculiar physics of these sloping tiers generated fierce internal stress, pushing both down and away. Under such pressures, the lower blocks separated from the core, and the step pyramid collapsed. It would take a new generation of builders to finally perfect the art of monumental stonework. When we return, the Fourth Dynasty pushes the pyramid skyward, beyond anything seen before. The Nile River, lifeline of ancient Egypt, food for its body and its soul. The river's yearly flood enriched the land with a blanket of fertile earth, brought down from the heart of Africa. The Nile Valley was a narrow strip of paradise in a desert wasteland. Here, the willing soil yielded all manner of produce to feed the greatest civilization of the ancient world. Beyond the Nile to the west lay the burial grounds of Egypt's kings. During the centuries that Memphis was Egypt's capital, from about 3000 to 2100 BC, an extended necropolis district, roughly 80 miles in length, grew up along the western bank of the Nile. All told, the kings of Egypt constructed some 90 pyramids. Today, most are little more than crumbling ruins. Snefru, the first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, began his reign around 2575 BC. He would pave the way from the stepped to the smooth-sided true pyramid. It wasn't an easy road. This was once a pyramid. It stands at a place called Meidum on the west bank of the Nile. Snefru originally built it as a 7-step pyramid, then enlarged it to 8 steps. Late in his reign, he filled in the steps to form a true pyramid. Its stark appearance today may be evidence of severe structural failure, or simply the disrespectful work of time.
This is the earliest of Snefru's pyramids. He then goes a bit farther north to a place called Dashur, and he builds what's called the Bent Pyramid. And the Bent Pyramid is very interesting because when you look at it in profile, it is bent. It's going up at one particular angle on its slope, and then about halfway up, the angle becomes shallower.
Nobody had yet built a true pyramid. Snefru's architects were literally learning on the job. When large cracks and shifts developed inside this pyramid, they greatly reduced its angle of ascent from 54 to 43 degrees. The structure held together. In building the Bent Pyramid, Snefru made a simple but crucial discovery. Laying blocks in horizontal rather than sloping layers or courses resulted in a structure that was as solid as bedrock.
The first horizontal coursing, when they stopped putting the stones like this, is said to be in the upper part of the Bent Pyramid. Certainly the North Pyramid, it's all horizontal coursing.
While the Bent Pyramid was being completed, Snefru started yet another tomb at Dashur. It is known both as the North Pyramid for its location and as the Red Pyramid for the distinctive color of its limestone blocks. This time, Snefru built from the ground up at 43 degrees. This time, Snefru erected a picture-perfect true pyramid, the first one ever built. Snefru and his architects can also take credit for inventing the corbelled vault, a clever way to outwit limestone's inherent weakness in spanning large spaces.
They bring the sides of the chamber in at a certain height for that course of stones, and then they set the next course of stones in a little bit more, and the next course higher up in a little bit more, and in a little bit more, until finally they close it up at the top.
Egypt's long and glorious tradition of building with colossal stone blocks began with Snefru. His stonemasons developed ways to quarry and transport unwieldy slabs weighing thousands of pounds.
There were different techniques for quarrying depending upon the sort of stone. If it were a hard stone, like diorite or granite, or a soft stone like limestone. In any case, it was a lot of work. For the soft stone, they could use saws and chisels made out of annealed copper. In later period, they would use bronze tools.
The dimensions of the block were first marked out on the raw stone. Then narrow spaces, known as separation trenches, were cut between the blocks. Quarry workers chiseled under the block as far as they could reach, then pried out the stone using heavy wooden levers. In certain locations, the Egyptians were forced to burrow beneath the surface to reach veins of solid stone fit for building. These were called covered quarries. Masons first had to carve a crawl space to the back, then cut a small trench to work in. Stooping here, they would chisel out the rock. The superior grade of limestone used as finishing or casing stones on most pyramids came from a place called Tura, near modern-day Cairo. Tura was a covered quarry, and because of the difficulty in extracting it, Tura limestone was among the most expensive of materials. Some builders tried to get it at a discount.
You have two options. One, you can go to Tura and you can quarry the stone. Or two, you can go to a pyramid and you can take off the conveniently quarried stones that have already been used. The place where you would start to remove these stones naturally is the corners.
The most tortuous quarrying job of all was hammering out the slabs of granite used for statues, roofing beams, and obelisks. The numbing hardness of granite rendered metal tools utterly useless. Workers used pounding balls made of durable stone like dolerite to slowly beat down the granite, chip by chip, day after day.
It must have been terrible. Dusty, choking, hot. Their hearing must have been ruined with the incessant pounding of these balls. I don't think that people that did this kind of work lived very long. 40 was the average age of death in ancient Egypt, and these people must have died a lot sooner.
Egypt's granite quarries were located in the south at Aswan. Many of the gigantic blocks had to be transported some 600 miles north to the necropolis district of Memphis.
The principal way of moving heavy weights, up to 1,000 tons, 700 tons, 110 tons, from the quarry to the building site was by boat, probably by a transport barge. And the principal way of moving heavy weights overland was probably dragging them on sleds or sledges over a lubricated surface.
The unsung hero of monumental Egyptian building is rope. Not a single block or sculpture could have been moved without it. Rope is a subject of extreme interest to archaeologist Donald Ryan. An avid rock climber, Ryan uses modern nylon ropes whenever he feels like ambling up a near vertical cliff. He has also studied ancient cordage and can make rope from raw papyrus stalks just the way the ancient Egyptians did.
In trying to replicate the making of rope from papyrus, I've had to depend on scenes found in tombs that actually show the ancient Egyptians making rope. In one particular tomb scene, it shows not only the men in the swamp making the rope, but it also shows their tools, including a mallet that can be used to pound the stalks. So when I was making rope out of papyrus, I pound the stalks, and what that does is separates the fibers. and puts them in a state where they can be twisted.
It is these tough fibers that make papyrus an ideal material for rope. An ancient tomb relief suggested how one person might hold the pounded stalks in order to make them into a single cord.
The fibers are gathered and then twisted into strands. What gives the cordage integrity is when those strands are then combined by twisting them in the opposite directions. That's what produces the rope. And then in turn, one or two ropes might be combined together to produce a larger rope that's even stronger.
The colossal statue shown on this tomb painting towered more than 2 stories high and weighed some 60 tons, the kind of load that put handmade ropes to their severest test. The painting reveals a few other tricks of the trade. These workers carry what is called a sleeper, a length of wood that will be sunk into the ground to provide a hard surface for the sledge to ride on. Water or oil, perhaps even milk, was poured on the sleepers to lubricate the path of the sledge. Above, a man described as the artist of the tomb waves incense offerings to sanctify the task. The foreman stands on the statue's knee, clapping out a rhythm to coordinate the workers' efforts. It was the diverse talents of scribes, architects, stonemasons, shipbuilders, rope makers, and countless manual laborers, unified by the commanding personage of the pharaoh, that brought the pyramids into being.
Within the reign of Sneferu, you have the full development from step pyramid to true pyramid. Unfortunately, we're in a period where written records don't really exist. So why he did this, we have no idea.
Sneferu remains an intriguing mystery. At his command, the Egyptians built 3 gigantic pyramids, incorporating well over 100 million cubic feet of stone. At the same time, Sneferu presided over a flowering of experimentation that led to the first corbel vault, the first horizontal masonry, and the first true pyramid. It is hardly the legacy of a dictator. The historical period known as the Old Kingdom had begun. Sneferu's son Khufu would build on the lessons learned by his father and take the pyramid to astounding new heights on a rocky plateau overlooking the Nile at a place called Giza. New York has the most, at least half a dozen. Chicago has 3. Milwaukee had one of the first soaring structures that for a brief but memorable time held the title of world's tallest building. However, for most of recorded history, only one building dominated the world's skyline, the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu in Giza. Nearly 500 feet high, Khufu's pyramid was the tallest building on the planet for more than 4,000 years. Khufu's immense stone tomb is the northernmost of 3 large pyramids erected on the Giza Plateau, across the Nile from modern-day Cairo. Building it was like moving a mountain. Workers carved more than 2 million blocks from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, then hauled them 300 yards to the building site. There they mounded the bedrock skyward, forming the pyramid. Khufu's tomb rises some 40% higher than Sneferu's North Pyramid. Its sides are angled at a bold 52 degrees, appreciably steeper than Sneferu dared to go. On the pyramid's east side, Khufu built the first large-scale mortuary temple. It served the same purpose as the offering chapel on the east side of the mastaba, but on a more imposing scale. A covered stone causeway connected it to the so-called Valley Temple, entryway to the pyramid complex. Perhaps Khufu's major accomplishment is the astonishing precision of his pyramid. The entire 13-acre base is leveled to within 7/8 of an inch. The lengths of its 4 sides vary by less than 2 inches, and each side aligns with one of the 4 cardinal directions.
And in fact, those sides not only face north, south, east, and west, they face them with remarkable accuracy. They were not sloppy about it. The accuracy of alignment is high and intentional.
No one knows how Khufu's architects achieved such precision. We are left to marvel and speculate, basing our assumptions on later periods in Egyptian history. For alignment with the cardinal directions, builders probably looked to the stars. Among the scenes carved on New Kingdom temples more than 1,000 years after Khufu was this ceremony known as the stretching of the cord. The pharaoh and a goddess are shown marking out the temple boundaries with stakes and a rope.
We also know from the texts that accompany these depictions that the stars were used to do this. In fact, the Big Dipper, the stars we know as the Big Dipper, were part of the process. What we don't know is what was the detail of this.
According to one theory, the Egyptians pinpointed true north through a simple process, beginning with the construction of a level, circular wall. While inside the circle and looking in a northerly direction, observers track a single star, marking its rising and setting on the wall. Drawing a line halfway between these 2 points is dead-on true north. A pyramid built on this axis will be aligned with the cardinal directions. Tracking stars and laying out pyramid plans was probably done by scribes or priests, not kings. If the pharaoh did participate, it was almost certainly a purely ceremonial act after the real surveying had been completed. This kind of ritual still takes place in modern society.
It's not done exactly the same way. I mean, you don't get the mayor out there with a woman dressed up like an Egyptian goddess and a couple of poles and a loop of rope, but you do get a bunch of dignitaries out there with spades, digging a hole in the ground that's already been surveyed and has already been planned, and for which we already know where we're going.
For measuring distance, tomb paintings indicate that the Egyptians used nothing more than a long cord, knotted at regular intervals. If Khufu's pyramid, with its near-perfect dimensions, was indeed laid out with this simple tool, it surely ranks as one of the virtuoso uses of rope in all of human history. Khufu's innovations go beyond profound accuracy and colossal size. 3 separate chambers lie suspended within this monumental stack of blocks. At the highest level is the king's chamber, the burial vault of Khufu. He is the only pharaoh who chose to be interred within a pyramid rather than beneath it. No one knows why. The chamber is built of perfectly joined slabs of polished red granite. The broken corner of Khufu's sarcophagus is almost certainly the work of robbers who plundered the tomb in ancient times. Above, 18-foot granite beams reach across the width of the room, the largest distance yet spanned by Egyptian builders. Hidden above the ceiling is an ingeniously designed, weight-relieving structure.
They built a series of chambers, one on top of another, at the same floor dimensions as the king's chamber, separated by a single course of granite or limestone. They then put pented limestone beams so that the weight of the pyramid pushes down like this. So this whole accordion-like construction was a way to resolve the problems of the biggest pyramid in the world weighing down on the burial chamber. And they succeeded. But there are some cracks in the roofing beams of the king's chamber, so there was some diciness to it.
The entryway, originally hidden under limestone blocks, was supported by 2 pairs of massive pented beams. The sheer magnitude of the Great Pyramid has led to endless speculation about Khufu. One of the earliest accounts comes from the inquisitive historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC. Khufu had already been dead for some 2,000 years, but his reputation for tyranny lived on. Khufu closed down the temples and compelled one and all to labor in his service. Some were forced to drag blocks of stone to the Nile from quarries in the Arabian hills. 100,000 men labored constantly. The pyramid itself was 20 years in building. Modern research has somewhat redeemed Khufu's reputation.
We do have what we think are slaves, but they number very, very few, and they're generally prisoners of war. The ideas of vast legions of slaves chained and forced to make these monuments is really a total misnomer.
Many Egyptologists now believe that a core group of skilled workers, such as masons, scribes, and architects, tended the construction year-round. According to this theory, most heavy stonework was done during the months of the Nile inundation, when farmlands were unworkable. Unskilled laborers by the thousands flocked to Giza and worked for rations of bread and beer. But just how many thousands, and for how many years? Craig Smith is among those who have proposed an answer. Smith is a program manager, a specialist in overseeing large-scale construction projects. His assignments have ranged from remodeling the Pentagon to planning the subway system in Seoul, Korea. Smith traveled to Giza to size up Khufu's tomb for himself. Working with Mark Lehner, and later with other construction experts, Smith began to calculate what went into building the Great Pyramid. He would arrive at some startling results.
We started looking at it and using the tools that a modern program manager would use, which involves, first of all, what we call a work breakdown structure, which is just a way of looking at all the different tasks that make up any complex project. Then we went into more detail and tried to look at the time it took to do each of the individual activities, and from that then to develop an overall schedule and plan for how the pyramids actually were built.
According to Smith, the workforce reached a peak of around 40,000 early in the process, while the lower tiers were being built and the majority of blocks were placed. The total dropped off as fewer blocks needed positioning. Among the most difficult phases of construction was lifting the massive blocks onto the ever-rising stone platform that would one day be the pyramid. If modern builders tackled this kind of job, they would use a crane with the proper load rating, some heavy-duty lifting slings, and plenty of wire rope. Khufu got the job done with little more than Stone Age tools. And he had a ramp. Most experts believe that an inclined plane of 10 degrees or less, built of rubble and other scrap material, was the Egyptians' secret weapon for lifting blocks from ground level onto a pyramid. However, there were some important constraints.
First of all, it was very clearly obvious to us that they didn't build one giant ramp up to the top of the pyramid, because a quick calculation will show you that takes more volume, more materials, and more labor than it takes to build the pyramid itself. So we had envisioned a model where they built a ramp up to the third of the height up. That was sufficient to get more than half the blocks in place. And then from then on, with a smaller number of blocks, we envisioned ramps that circled around the construction, were built off of the pyramid itself, and enable them to proceed up that way and finish it.
Once the core blocks were in place, stonemasons installed the pyramid's shell of Tura limestone. They worked from the top down, removing the ramp as they descended. Smith's calculations suggest that this gargantuan effort may have been completed in far less time than was previously suspected.
We believe then from our model, the construction was actually completed in about 10 years. As I look back on it, I marvel at their ability to do such a tremendous project. It's really been done to a precision that would challenge modern builders today.
Khufu's Great Pyramid has inspired awed appreciation since ancient times and ensured that his name will be remembered, perhaps for eternity. It is one of the wicked ironies of history that the only known statue of Khufu is this small ivory figurine that would be over its head in a pickle jar. Khufu died in 2528 BC. Under subsequent pharaohs, the pyramid would decline in size and quality, a symptom of the king's dwindling power. Egypt was headed for a chaotic breakdown that would last more than 100 years. Khufu's great stone tomb marked the peak of Egyptian pyramid building. Never again would these royal monuments rise so high. The decline was gradual, imperceptible at first. It began with Khufu's son Khafre. He ascended to the throne of Egypt in 2520 BC, the fourth pharaoh of the fourth dynasty. Khafre constructed his tomb next door to the Great Pyramid. As originally built, it was 10 feet shorter than Khufu's. However, by planting it on a layer of bedrock some 30 feet higher, Khafre managed to create the illusion that he had the tallest pyramid. Today, Khafre's pyramid, with its casing still intact at the top, is often assumed to be the Great Pyramid. The Giza Plateau was host to yet a third generation of royal burials. But the tomb built here by the pharaoh Menkaure was less than half the size of its colossal neighbors. And few of the pyramids to come would reach even this modest height.
In the later Old Kingdom, especially in the 5th and 6th dynasties, pyramids became very standardized. The burial chamber was no longer ever up in the body of the pyramid. It was always down close to ground level, and the pyramids were smaller.
The mortuary complex on the east side of the pyramid burial vault had now become a regular feature of the royal tomb. Once the king's body was secreted within the pyramid, the mortuary temple became the site of ongoing rituals and offerings. These ceremonies would assure the pharaoh's eternal life, but only if they were faithfully performed forever. The 5th dynasty pharaoh Unas wasn't taking any chances. He introduced a new Egyptian building custom designed to take the uncertainty out of eternity. Wall-to-wall funerary prayers known as the pyramid texts. Here were spells, incantations, hymns, laments, and litanies, surrounding the pharaoh's body like a protective veil. They empowered the Ka to achieve eternal life, and they didn't need a priest in order to work their magic. They were effective simply by their presence.
It's generally believed that the inscriptions that were put inside were copied from papyrus rolls that originally had been used in recitation at funerals and religious rites earlier. But it's only relatively late that they decide to put them on the walls to perpetuate them.
The tombs of scribes, overseers, military leaders, and other members of the elite were also filled with images and text. Much of the decoration recites the tomb owner's accomplishments and virtues to show themselves worthy of entering the next world.
Tombs, as well as statues and almost anything that was paid for by the person planning their afterlife, would have long inscriptions that were undoubtedly composed, at least in concert with the tomb owner. Clearly, that person wanted to have some control over what that monument stated about him or her. This was their last, and in fact, one of their most important comments about themselves that they were making.
In modern times, the deceased are still memorialized with inscriptions. However, the messages on these tombstones are far shorter than those of ancient Egypt, and few people plan to write their own epitaph.
Most people aren't planning on dying, so they don't even think about that. It's the wishes of the loved ones that put on there, and sometimes it's just a simple beloved husband and father, beloved wife and mother, just a normal description showing who's left. A lot of people like to show the loved one's interest by putting a design on the marker, for example, a fishing pole for a fisherman, some other item like that.
However, on rare occasions, a marker design is prepared in advance by the deceased.
The lady that had passed away, she had drawn a very nice sketch of a large umbrella and her whole family under the umbrella, all the kids, and then we took that sketch and then engraved it into the stone. And of course, naturally, that made the loved ones very happy to be able to do that. I mean, it was really personal.
In ancient Egypt, family members were perhaps the most frequent subject for funeral stelae, carved stone tablets placed in the tomb. Here, deceased parents look back from the netherworld as their daughter brings offerings that will sustain them in the hereafter. In the private household, as in the great household of Egypt, proper ritual ensured order and prosperity. However, around 2150 BC, the Egyptians' orderly universe came crashing down. Written records depict a cataclysmic failure of the Nile, the once mighty flow choked into a freakish river of parched earth. Crops failed, and starvation drained the vitality out of Egypt. The Old Kingdom withered away under a succession of weak pharaohs. Civil wars flared as local rulers carved the Nile Valley into rival fiefdoms. The social discord is reflected in some funeral stelae of the period. Gone is the tranquil contemplation of an eternal afterlife. This tomb owner is well armed, the worldly troubles of Egypt very much on his mind. A warrior prince from the south named Mentuhotep reunited the country in 2040 BC, opening the period known as the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep moved Egypt's capital to his native Thebes and built his funeral complex across the river at Deir el-Bahri. Even lying in ruins, Mentuhotep's tomb can be seen as an obvious break with the pyramid tradition. An elegant terraced structure, it was probably derived from a funerary building style developed by the local rulers of Thebes. These Theban tombs had a broad courtyard sloping to the west, where a row of columns and a burial vault were hewn into bedrock. Mentuhotep also cut his burial chamber into the rock, but the rest of his tomb was a freestanding structure. It included Egypt's first large-scale stone hypostyle hall. Hypostyle comes from a Greek word meaning under pillars. All told, this hall had 80 of them. Mentuhotep had introduced stunning new elements into the repertoire of Egyptian building. Then, nothing happened.
After Mentuhotep, the rest of the kings of the Middle Kingdom pretty much went back to the concept of the built pyramidal structure, although they weren't on the scale of their ancestors. They certainly were different from the structures that Mentuhotep used.
With a casing of fine Tura limestone, a Middle Kingdom pyramid affected the look of its predecessors. However, it didn't have the guts. Its central core was nothing but a stack of mud bricks. While mud was cheaper and faster to use than stone, it was a bad bet to last an eternity. Case in point, the so-called Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III in Dashur. Once its limestone casing was stolen, the pyramid was left defenseless.
People would go to the Black Pyramid and quarry out a little section and take it back and spread it on their fields. And over thousands of years, the pyramid has disappeared into the fields as well as simply weathering away. That faceless lump of black mud brick was actually once a gleaming white pyramid, just like all the others.
In the end, the Middle Kingdom pharaohs left few great monuments. Perhaps their use of mud brick was merely symptomatic of deeper problems, a depleted treasury and an inability to command their subjects. A tribe known as the Hyksos sensed Egypt's weakness and encroached from the east. The Nubians penetrated from the south. By 1640 BC, Egypt was under the heel of foreign invaders. Once the greatest nation on earth, by 1650 BC, Egypt had become the property of strangers. The Hyksos ruled in the north, the Nubians in the south. The next 100 years was a time of weakness and subservience, known as the Second Intermediate Period. It was a confident Theban ruler named Amosa who finally pushed the foreign rulers out of Egypt around 1550 BC. But Amosa didn't stop at Egypt's borders. He marched his troops into the neighboring kingdoms and brought them under his control. Thus, the clatter of spears and the thunder of chariots announced the birth of Egypt's sprawling empire and the dazzling era of the New Kingdom. Now in control of their own destinies, this new line of pharaohs, the 18th dynasty, re-examined the tombs of their predecessors. Nearly all had been plundered, the mummies desecrated. As a design for royal tombs, the pyramid was finished. However, the burial vault and mortuary chapel, the two essential elements dating back to the mastaba, would continue in the New Kingdom. They would just be dramatically repositioned. For the first time, the burial vault would be separate, located far from the mortuary temple. The royal mummy would be hidden in a rugged desert canyon west of Thebes, the Valley of the Kings. There, beneath a mountain that nature had shaped into a pyramid, it was hoped the pharaohs would rest undisturbed forever. The change appears to date from the reign of Thutmosis I, around 1500 BC. The tomb of his architect Aneni contains this inscription, taking credit for the radical innovation.
I built the tomb in the mountains, no one seeing, no one hearing. I hid it. And from that time on, in the New Kingdom, you have the burials in the Valley of the Kings.
The Valley of the Kings may still hold some secrets, but already more than 50 tombs have been discovered here. These vaults were cut directly into the limestone bedrock and show great variety in their arrangement of corridors, stairways, shafts, and chambers. The sarcophagus containing the mummified body of the pharaoh was placed in the tomb's innermost chamber.
This is normally in the westernmost part of the tomb, also the direction that's associated in the ancient Egyptian mind with death. The rest of the tomb is an avenue, a corridor, almost a birth canal, if you want, for the spirit to come out of when it is reborn in the morning.
A few architectural plans for these tombs still survive. This drawing includes room descriptions and dimensions. The Egyptian unit of measure was the royal cubit, the distance from Pharaoh's elbow to the tip of his middle finger. A cubit usually equaled about 20 inches, but it varied from reign to reign, depending on the size of the king. The tomb builders lived apart from other commoners in this walled enclave called Deir el-Medina. During most periods, 60 workers and their families lived in this town.
These men had all sorts of special prerogatives. Their job was to build the royal tombs. As a result, they had tremendous support staffs, people who would bring water, who would do the fishing for them, who would grow the vegetables, because they were then left free to do what they did best, which was build the royal tombs.
The first recorded labor strike in history was staged during the reign of Ramses III by the tomb builders of Deir el-Medina. When their wages didn't arrive, they dared to quit working on the pharaoh's tomb and march into the offices of his chancellor to demand payment.
The incident of the strike is actually written down in official records. I mean, it was reported to Pharaoh. Your best workmen are striking, and I'm sure he was quite irritated about the whole thing, not so much with the workmen, but the people who were responsible for getting them their salaries and their wages, because these are the people who made the royal tombs, and nothing was more important to a pharaoh than that tomb where he was going to live and survive for eternity.
The workers were paid, and Ramses III got his tomb. Like the other New Kingdom pharaohs, Ramses also built a separate mortuary temple, where priests could perform the rituals necessary to sustain him in the afterlife. These funerary monuments were built within a few miles of the Valley of the Kings, across the Nile from Thebes. The temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu is among the best preserved. Nearly all New Kingdom temples were designed with a similar layout. Medinet Habu is a perfect example. The temple faces the world with an imposing facade, known as a pylon gateway. It is the signature architectural form of the New Kingdom, just as the pyramid was for the Old Kingdom. The entryway through the pylon creates a ritual and architectural axis that leads into the temple. Behind the pylon lies an open courtyard bordered by pillared hallways. In some cases, as at Medinet Habu, there are two such uncovered areas. Beyond these courtyards, the temple structure was originally overlaid with roofing beams. Here in the deepest recesses of the mortuary temple was the focal point of the axis, a shrine containing the statue of a god.
Those mortuary cults were actually amalgamated with the cult of a god, and the god is Amun-Ra, who is the great god of Thebes and of the empire. So those temples are actually built in honor of a form of Amun-Ra with which the dead king is identified, and that's how the dead king ensures his regeneration.
Besides time and geography, one central belief separates the temples of ancient Thebes from the various temples active in America today.
When you think of a modern church or a mosque or synagogue, this is a place where people go to worship. When you go to an ancient Egyptian temple, you're looking at something different. You're looking at the home of the god. The outer part of the temple, with its pylon facade and its court, if it's accessible to the public, it's only accessible on limited numbers of days. As you go farther back into the temple, you're actually going into areas that are more and more exclusive. This is the area of the priests.
This was once the temple's inner sanctum. Its columns are now truncated and its roof beams long since carried away. Here the priests worked their magic, keeping the pharaoh's ka forever vital in the afterlife. Just down the road from Medinet Habu stands the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramses II. Ramses was especially fond of colossal statues of himself. The bigger, the better. Many lie in ruins at the Ramesseum.
The heaviest weight that the Egyptians ever moved, of which we know, was the great granite statue of Ramses that inspired the poem by Shelley, Ozymandias, A Shattered Visage Lies. It is estimated to have weighed 1,000 tons.
This impossibly large statue still lies where it fell, overturned by one of the few forces greater than Ramses, an earthquake. In building his mortuary temple, Ramses made the most of a new construction material that finally allowed the pharaohs to defy gravity.
In the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, the major stone they built in was limestone. For example, the pyramids are built out of limestone. At the beginning of the New Kingdom, tremendous quarries of sandstone were opened in southern Egypt at a site called Gebel Silsila. And this sandstone can span a much longer distance. So building in sandstone allowed the pharaohs to build much larger scale buildings than had been previously possible.
Amenhotep III was another pharaoh with a taste for the monumental.
The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III on the West Bank was the largest mortuary temple ever built in that area. It covers an enormous expanse. In fact, the outer limits of the temple have not really been discovered.
However, much of the building was made of mud brick, virtually all that remains of the colossal statues of Amenhotep that stared down at anyone who approached his temple. The oldest surviving mortuary temple holds court at a place called Deir el-Bahri, just over a ridge from the Valley of the Kings. Clearly inspired by the tomb of Mentuhotep, which lies just to the south, this stately temple was built by Hatshepsut, the most powerful female ruler in Egypt's history. Indeed, Hatshepsut referred to herself as a king and built some of Egypt's greatest royal monuments.
The temple at Deir el-Bahri that Hatshepsut built was in many ways a very unusual temple for its time. Even if you walk up to the temple today, you can see that it stands in two great levels. These are two enormous terraces that she partially built and partially excavated into this rocky cliff on the west bank of Thebes. Each terrace is fronted by an elaborate portico, and in the center, a ramp gives access from terrace to terrace. And then finally, several sanctuaries that are cut into the cliff itself, the central one being for the god Amun, and a separate one for Hatshepsut, and a third one for her father. Now, leading up to this temple was an enormous causeway that was originally lined with sphinxes of Hatshepsut along the way.
Some of the tools that may have been used to make those granite sphinxes found their way into the archaeological collection at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland.
I'm holding in my hand a wooden hammer that was used by the ancient Egyptian builders 3,500 years ago to build the temple of Queen Hatshepsut in Thebes. It was found there among things that were left by the builders, and you can see how well used it actually was. This is a stone made of basalt, one of the most dense materials that you can find in ancient Egypt, and so they would use something like this that would actually break granite. So what you see here are very well used and actual implements used by the ancient Egyptian builders.
Hatshepsut and the other New Kingdom pharaohs did more than build for their own immortality. Egypt was now an empire, its storehouses overflowing with tribute from conquered nations. Egypt's kings apparently felt indebted to Amun-Ra for their victories, and they showed their gratitude by building him the biggest temple complex the world has ever seen. When we return, the Temple of Karnak, mansion of an imperial god. If the god Amun were to look down on the great temple built for him at Karnak, perhaps he would take pride in the pylons and columns that still stand. Or perhaps he would mourn the loss of so much beauty to the unceasing rub of time. Maybe he would simply marvel at the incalculable human effort expended on his behalf. For this was a project without end. Pylons and courtyards, colonnades and obelisks. Building continued here for more than 2,000 years. It would take the death of the Egyptian civilization itself to finally bring the work at Karnak to a halt. By then, the sacred precinct spread across 60 acres and included 20 temples for a variety of different gods. Even now, it is the largest religious complex on the face of the planet. The focus of all this effort was the god Amun-Ra. A small statue of Amun, much like this one, was kept in a sacred shrine at the rear of the temple complex. Over the centuries, the pharaohs built outward around Amun. The temple's successive stages of growth are still evident, like the rings of an ancient tree. Major construction at Karnak ended with the first pylon, which was left unfinished around 350 BC.
The first pylon is the western facade of the Great Temple of Amun. And what we look at today is the sort of rough, unfinished stonework when they ran out of money or they ran out of government support or somebody said, stop.
At the time work was terminated, a construction ramp was left in place behind the pylon. The ramp had brick walls and interior supports, with a core of dirt or rubble fill. This crumbling relic provides a unique view of Egyptian building techniques.
You laid a foundation. You then pulled on the first layer of stone. You build a ramp to the surface of that first layer of stone. You pull in another layer of stone. You raise the ramp, you pull in another layer of stone. And you keep on doing this until you reach the top. When it's finished, you remove the ramp. You then dress the surface of the stone as you're coming down. You remove more ramp, you dress more surface, and you come down to the ground level. Your monument is complete. The height of the ramp that must have been there to reach the height of the surviving pylon is impressive.
Behind Karnak's first pylon, an open courtyard leads to the astonishing grandeur of the temple's hypostyle hall. A central aisle leading to the shrine of Amun runs through the hall. Soaring 70-foot columns line the way. Beyond them, forests of still more columns, neatly arranged in rows. All told, Karnak's hypostyle hall boasts 134 pillars, more than any other such building in the world. This spectacular hall was once totally roofed over with massive sandstone beams. Building these giant columns and placing the blocks on top was another example of Egyptian building ingenuity.
Columns are not one large piece of stone. They're made up of individual drums which are laid one on top of another. Now, as they were building, rather than using scaffoldings, they actually filled the room with dirt and rubble, raised the floor level to create a working platform so they could move the next layer of stones onto the columns.
Workers built a ramp and dragged up the roofing beams. Then they began removing the rubble underneath, exposing the rough columns. Masons dressed the surfaces and cut in designs. Removing more dirt lowered the floor level, and the bottom drums were carved. The process was repeated until the pillared room was done. Karnak's hypostyle hall was built the old-fashioned way, block by block, tier by tier. However, the pharaohs also indulged in a curious custom known as usurpation, the shortcut way to get a building or monumental sculpture.
Normally, when a king finished a monument, he would cover it with inscriptions, and among those inscriptions, he would prominently include his name as the builder of the monument. Now, in ancient Egypt, it was very common for a later king to usurp that monument. In other words, to change the name on the monument by simply cutting away the name of the original king and inserting his own name. Because in ancient Egypt, to put your name on something really was truly to claim ownership of it.
Though some pharaohs took steps to avoid being usurped, this sleight of hand was actually acceptable in the Egyptian concept of kingship.
Once the pharaoh came into the office of kingship, which was in fact divine, he then was the king who had existed before and would exist in perpetuity. So every building that had been built actually belonged to that king who now was in office. By the time we get to Ramses III, who had seen what Ramses II had done, whenever he puts his cartouche on the walls of his temple, he makes them so deep that they would be virtually impossible to fill in and take over by another king.
Statues could also be usurped by recarving the pharaoh's name, typically found on the belt buckle or rear support pillar. Even statues of the mighty Ramses II were considered fair game. A later king by the name of Pinedjem usurped this one at Karnak, or so he thought.
Underneath the statue, that is to say, where the soles of the feet would be, you find the name of Ramses II, carved in very deep hieroglyphs. And he put that there so that should anyone else come and erase his name from the back pillar or take it off his belt buckle, they would probably never to think to look under his feet. So that while common people might think this is Pinedjem, the gods would still see that this is a statue of Ramses II.
Occasionally, a king would exact a more lethal toll on a predecessor's work. The results can be seen at Karnak. The temple is one of the few to have a second ritual corridor, this one entering from the south. It was along the southern axis that excavation turned up clues to this dramatic episode. The north-south axis leads past the sacred lake, where Karnak's priests bathed before their daily rituals, and then through several pylons, today only partially restored. The ceremonial avenue culminates in a formal entryway on the southern wall of the precinct. Egyptologists discovered that limestone blocks used as fill inside two of these pylons were painted and carved. They proved to be remnants of an enigmatic chapter in Egyptian history, the age of Akhenaten. The curious depictions of Akhenaten have led some to claim that illness left his body and character spectacularly deformed. Others see his portraits as the oddly sensual style of a visionary who junked the conventions of art, religion, and architecture. No one knows for sure. Akhenaten has not yet emerged from the shadows.
Akhenaten and his time is one of the most interesting and puzzling aspects of all of ancient Egyptian civilization, because it's the one time when the civilization broke its mold in 3,000 years of history.
Beginning around 1350 BC, during the waning years of the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten engineered a stunning spiritual revolution. He pushed aside the many gods of Egypt and replaced them with one god, Aten, the disk of the sun.
He began a change in the religion, which some people have said makes him the world's first individual, the world's first thinker, the world's first philosopher, and in fact, the world's first monotheist. Others refer to him as the heretic pharaoh, who was pretty much involved with his own thoughts and not really governing the kingdom the way it should have been governed.
Akhenaten was often pictured with his wife, Nefertiti, and their children. Some experts believe Akhenaten wanted the royal family to be regarded as deities, substitutes for the ancient gods he had rejected. At the height of his religious fervor, Akhenaten abandoned Thebes and constructed an entirely new capital 150 miles north. He called it Akhenaten, horizon of the sun disk. Here, Akhenaten could build his religious beliefs directly into stone. He decreed that temples be constructed with open or broken lintels. This design ensured that nothing would block the sun's sacred light. Rituals for the Aten were performed in an open courtyard, rather than in a dark shrine, as had been done for the old Egyptian gods. Akhenaten even conducted state business outside, under the full glare of the Egyptian sun.
We have a letter from a foreign king to Akhenaten complaining about Akhenaten making the king's ambassadors stand out in the sunlight and saying, basically, if you want to stand out in the sunlight all day and worship your God, go ahead, but don't make my ambassadors do it.
In another break with tradition, Akhenaten had his monuments built out of small stone blocks, roughly 20 by 10 by 9 inches. They were easily quarried, transported, and fashioned into walls. Of course, they were just as easy to tear down. Akhenaten died in 1335 BC, and soon after, the old religion was restored. Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, ascended to the throne in 1319. He set his sights on the monuments of Akhenaten.
It was during Horemheb's reign where all of Akhenaten's monuments were basically destroyed and dismantled. And most of these blocks that were used for building his temples were dismantled and used as filler in the pylons or gateways that Horemheb built at the Temple of Amun at Karnak.
When a later pharaoh carved a list of Egypt's kings on a temple at Abydos, Akhenaten was not included. As his successors saw it, he was an abomination who should never have existed.
He became a non-person. The Egyptians had a concept called ma'at, which means truth. But it isn't truth with sort of a capital T. It's sort of a truth that, well, this is what was supposed to happen, not necessarily what actually did happen.
Akhenaten's temples and palaces vanished from the face of the earth. His legacy remains swallowed up in New Kingdom pylons for more than 3,000 years. Even now, those wishing to understand this mysterious king must literally piece together his story from the rubble. The great stone structures of ancient Egypt have other stories to tell. When we return, building meaning into monuments, the symbolic side of Egyptian architecture. In ancient Egypt, size definitely mattered. The sheer scale of the royal tombs, temples, and statues was calculated to induce a sense of stunned admiration. But there is another dimension to these sacred places. Built into each structure are symbolic meanings that are as important as the foundations upon which it rested.
Ancient Egyptian buildings, temples in particular, were simply symbols of the universe in miniature.
Sky, earth, flood, harvest. This was the universe or cosmos that surrounded the ancient Egyptians. Royal architects linked their sacred monuments to the cosmos by representing its potent natural forces in stone.
The core idea of ancient Egyptian funerary structures is agricultural. When an Egyptian farmer took a seed that was apparently dead and put it into the ground and made a little mound of earth over it, something magical happened. A living thing came from it, a plant. What made this happen in the Egyptians' mind was the god Osiris. Osiris was the force that enabled life to come from apparent death. The mound of earth over a seed is the core idea of ancient Egyptian funerary structures. The body within the tomb is the seed, and the tomb itself, the superstructure, is simply the mound of earth.
This agricultural symbol of rebirth was at the heart of every royal tomb, from pyramids and mastabas to the burial vaults in the Valley of the Kings. At the same time, many of these tombs made reference to a second dimension of the cosmos, the heavens. The Egyptians had observed that the stars around the north pole of the sky never dipped below the horizon. They seemed to be the embodiment of eternal life. The pyramid texts that began appearing in the 5th dynasty envisioned the pharaoh's life after death among these imperishable northern stars.
His soul ascends to the sky and becomes, in that sense, immortal, like the immortal stars that circled around the pole of the sky. What the pharaoh's really doing is the same thing he did when he was alive on Earth. He's running the cosmos.
Even before these texts appeared, the very architecture of the pyramid suggested that the link to the northern polar stars had already been made. Without exception, every 3rd and 4th dynasty pyramid had an entry corridor descending from its north side. This hallway, angled at roughly 30 degrees, launched the car straight towards the immortal stars in the northern sky. Inside the pyramids, the burial vault ceiling was often carved or painted with a field of stars, another reminder of the pharaoh's eternal destination. Some even see the design of Djoser's step pyramid as a stairway to his celestial afterlife. But tombs also reflected a third face of the cosmos, the sun. Some say its slanting rays are represented in stone by the sides of the pyramid. The pyramid shape may also be linked to the solar cult that flourished in the city of Heliopolis, long since swallowed up by the desert. A later pharaoh constructed what is believed to be a replica of the Sun Temple at Heliopolis. Its cult figure was a small pyramid-shaped stone, overlaid with gold and perched on a squat podium. Together, they formed an obelisk.
The obelisk, like all other architecture in ancient Egypt, is a religious symbol. The top, of course, is a pyramid shape. In ancient Egyptian, it's called the benben. It was a symbol of the sun, which was very important to the Egyptians because the sun was imperishable. It was born each morning, it died each night to be reborn the following day, and so it had the sense of continuity and eternity.
There is some evidence that the mysterious Sphinx may also be connected to the cult of the sun. The clues can be found in the ruins of a temple located just in front of the great stone beast. It is one of the few Egyptian temples to have 2 sanctuaries.
The form of it suggests that it was a solar temple. These 2 sanctuaries are on the east-west axis of the temple. They happen not to point at the Sphinx, which you might expect, but they point just past the Sphinx, up the plateau. And it's right on that axis that the sun sets at the equinox.
The temples of the New Kingdom were built with symbolic references, from the inner sanctuary to the front pylon towers.
The pylon or gateway was in the shape of the hieroglyph for horizon, so that the temple itself had cosmological significance, and all the decoration reflected that as well.
From the earliest times, the papyrus symbolized Lower Egypt and the lotus Upper Egypt. Their use in art and architecture was a constant reminder that Pharaoh ruled over both lands. Temple columns were often sculpted to resemble a single stalk of papyrus with fronds unfurled. They also appear bundled, with foliage tightly wrapped. In some colonnades, most notably those built by Ramses II, this finely detailed bundling was abandoned in favor of a monolithic appearance. Some have dismissed columns of this style as gouty monstrosities. The lotus can be found in bundled form or carved in bold relief, as on this pillar at Karnak. Perhaps no place is more diverse in symbolism than Ramses II's temple at Abu Simbel. Here, Ramses sculpted the side of a mountain into gargantuan statues of himself. The figures loom 6 stories above the ground. Ramses made sure to connect Abu Simbel to the universe. He placed statues of himself and 3 gods in the deepest recesses of the temple at the end of a carefully planned hallway. Twice a year, the sun enters the temple, comes to Ramses, and bathes him in its glow. But there is another, more worldly symbolism at Abu Simbel.
Its location far south of Aswan, far south of the border of ancient Egypt, is very, very deliberate. This was placed there really as a political statement. At this time, during the time of Ramses II, there was a tremendous amount of rivalry between the Egyptians and the Nubians, the group who lived to the south of Egypt. Abu Simbel really served like a giant signboard for the Nubians saying, don't come further north than this temple.
This fearsome king, Ramses II, is hardly the person that comes to mind in connection with a sentimental gesture. Yet there exists at Abu Simbel a second temple that appears to be just that. It was dedicated to Nofretari, Ramses' first and favorite among many wives and uncounted concubines.
It's clearly a sign of his affection for her, and the fact that the facade of the temple has alternating statues of Ramses and his wife, both generally the same size, is another indication of the affection and esteem in which he held her. Now, ironically enough, we think that Nofretari died about the time that that temple was consecrated, so we don't know if Nofretari ever got to see her temple.
These days, hardly anyone carves a mountain for their beloved. There are, however, still a few architectural references to the cosmos. You just have to know where to look.
Here in Los Angeles, sort of the termination of the Hollywood Walk of Fame, there's a little structure that looks like the kid brother to the Eiffel Tower. But in fact, and I think quite without plan, it incorporates the full catalog of cosmological symbolism. It's got 4 women of Hollywood's famous history holding up a dome, like the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 directions hold up the sky. It has a cosmic axis reaching out of that dome up into the heavens, and Marilyn Monroe's up there at the summit presiding like a goddess over the entire cosmos.
The pyramid itself, perhaps the ultimate symbol of ancient Egypt, has traveled far beyond the banks of the Nile. When we return, the eternal appeal of Egyptian building. The ringing of chisel on stone no longer echoes through the Nile Valley. Egypt's great builders have long since gone to dust. However, their inspired designs have become the world's legacy, reborn countless times over the ages. Egyptian themes are often incorporated into modern funerary architecture. Monuments are trimmed with the age-old Cavetto cornice and Taurus molding, or carved with Egyptian symbols. In a Boston cemetery, an ever-vigilant sphinx commemorates the Civil War dead. Across the country, pyramid tombs rise in the shadow of Los Angeles City Hall. Modern builders sometimes revive the form, but not the meaning of Egyptian monuments. How else to explain memorializing George Washington with an obelisk, a symbol linked to the sun god Re? Up until this century, the mania for things Egyptian could be satisfied by actually carting off a statue or other large-scale relic. The obelisk was perhaps the ultimate souvenir of ancient Egypt. Monumental, exotic, tattooed with hieroglyphs, it was the perfect symbol of this extraordinary civilization. But taking home an obelisk offered something more. Here was a chance to relive the most spectacularly nerve-wracking drama faced by the ancient Egyptian builders themselves, wrestling with a colossal spike of brittle granite, knowing that one false move will cause it to instantly snap in half. This obelisk, originally erected by Thutmose III, was given to the United States in 1869 by Egypt's ruler, the Khedive Ismail. The daunting task of moving it was taken on by a naval officer named Henry H. Gorringe. At the time, the 7-story-high obelisk overlooked the harbor at Alexandria. Gorringe built a scaffolding around it and sheathed it in a protective wooden box. Then he gingerly lifted the obelisk off its base. Gorringe had to cut a hole in his steamship to get the massive obelisk into the hold. After harrowing journeys overseas and by railway, he was ready to erect the monument. Gorringe used a support harness of his own design to ease the obelisk into place. With a great creaking and groaning, the 224-ton obelisk settled onto its base in New York's Central Park. It can still be seen there today.
We really don't know for certain how the Egyptians erected the obelisks. We have several different theories. One of the best theories involved creating an enormous mud brick structure which surrounded the base of each obelisk. This structure had a ramp leading up to it, upon which the obelisk would be dragged on skids. Perhaps the area above the obelisk base itself was filled with sand, and so the obelisk would be tipped down into the sand, and then the sand could be removed from the bottom, and that way the obelisk would slowly descend down onto the base.
The pedestal itself seems to have played a crucial role in raising the obelisk.
Each one has a groove on one side, and we assume this was a groove that would catch the edge of the obelisk as it was lowered down over the base, and then the obelisk would be raised up from that angle.
While the Egyptians' building secrets may never be fully revealed, their distinctive style is instantly recognizable and widely imitated. Egyptian designs have transformed everything from corporate office buildings to movie theaters and public zoos. In the late 1960s, imitation turned to action. The construction of the Aswan Dam imperiled dozens of ancient temples in what was once Nubia. Even Ramses II found himself under assault as water inched towards the temple at Abu Simbel. An international rescue team launched a daring mission to save the monument. The plan required cutting the ancient temple into literally hundreds of pieces. Each section was numbered, cataloged, and stored. Eventually, the colossal structure was painstakingly reassembled some 200 feet above its former location and safely out of the water's reach.
Today, when you go to the temple, you cannot even see the signs of the saw blades that cut this temple into many pieces. It's an absolutely incredible engineering feat, something that probably Ramses II would admire.
The pharaohs would no doubt be surprised at the diverse uses we have dreamed up for the pyramid, here in the waning hours of the 20th century.
The inside of ancient pyramids were the most exclusive places the Egyptians could build. They were for the mortal remains of the god king. Modern pyramids, on the other hand, are for as many people as you can get into them, for sports arenas, like in Long Beach, for casinos, like in Las Vegas, or sports stadiums like the Memphis Pyramid. Modern pyramids are light and airy, and they're skeletal structures rather than massive, solid structures.
The architecture of Egypt has taken on a life of its own, independent of the pharaohs it once served. Still, credit will always belong to those ancient builders who adorned the Nile Valley with such timeless splendor.
Greatest builder in Egyptian history has to be Ramses II. Simply the number of monuments that he constructed and the scale of these monuments make him far and away the greatest of the ancient Egyptian builders.
Hatshepsut has to be ranked one of the greatest builders in Egypt. Maybe not the greatest, but her temple at Deir el-Bahri is really one of the architectural treasures of Egypt. She erected several pairs of obelisks at Karnak. She undertook a number of very important projects during the 12 or at most 15 years she was on the throne. So she didn't really have all that much time to build, but she used it extremely well.
In some respects, probably Snefru is one of the most important, because he develops the pyramid. When you get to the New Kingdom, probably Amenhotep III is the most important. He created sort of gargantuan architecture.
In their quest for eternity, these great pharaohs pushed the limits of art, science, and imagination. The result was a spirited marriage of grace and monumentality, a creative vision that is still a marvel 40 centuries later. Though today we routinely erect bigger buildings, it is perhaps with a measure of envy that we look back at this remarkably accomplished civilization, whose great builders made so much of mere mud and stone in their unhurried cosmos by the Nile.